Hello and welcome to this week's Politics in the Pulpit, our lectionary-based preaching resource brought to you by the Joint Public Issues team, designed to ask the provocative question of how and indeed whether politics should feature in our preaching this week. My name is David Mayne. I'm a Baptist minister based in Essex, and I am delighted to welcome another Essex-based friend onto the podcast this week, Revd Emma Nash. Emma is a Baptist Union accredited evangelist, currently seconded to the Methodist Church's Evangelism and Growth team. Emma is also the author of a book recently published by SCM earlier this year called A Pastoral Theology of Childlessness. This is genuinely my copy that is on my shelf here behind me, and it's available in all good and appropriate book purchasing facilities. Emma, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We're really pleased to have you on the podcast. So, politics and the pulpit. A natural partnership for you?
Well, yeah. So it's kind of an interesting one. I am, for want of a better phrase, a proclamational evangelist. To cut a very, very long story, very, very short. My calling is very clearly to speaking the gospel in words. However, I've had a strong social conscience since I was a teenager, and become increasingly convinced that these are inseparable parts of mission: speaking good news, enacting good news, seeing justice. I would also say that during the time I've been a minister, so I was ordained in 2013, so 8 years now, I've experienced frequent marginalization as a woman minister. Nothing too drastic, but a lot of what we might call microaggressions these days, a lot of subtle undermining, subtle marginalization. People quite often don't even realize they're doing it. And so I think when I preach, I'm also very aware of that power dynamic, that there may be people listening to me who don't think I should be up there. And also reading the Bible as someone who doesn't, recognizing that I still carry a lot of privilege. I don't have a disability. I'm straight, white, cisgendered. There's lots of privilege that I carry. I'm educated, and yet my gender has sort of made me conscious of a lot of these power dynamics in Scripture. Sometimes reading the Bible as a woman is uncomfortable.
Yeah, very much so. I'm always struck in conversations I would have with Bible study groups and things like that. I constantly say, if you've not found that difficult, I'm not sure what you've been reading, because I think there are some passages which are really challenging. We'll perhaps come on to some of that a bit later. So what are some of the political, social issues that are sort of big on your radar at the moment, either from your ministry context right now or just, from living generally? What are the big things for you at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I'll just show you my T-shirt. I'm wearing my now, my Greenpeace T-shirt. I've a couple of years ago, I was in Lancaster for work, and I wandered into a bookshop because I had a bit of time, and I picked up Mike Berners-Lee's book, There Is No Planet B. And I've been seeing a little bit about the school strikes for climate and the kind of youth movement that was going on. And I thought, I really need to read more about this. I need to get more of a sense. And I read it, and I was terrified. And I just thought, I need to do something about this. This is an emergency. This is a crisis. We've got to take action. What can I do? And I had this idea a couple of years ago about wearing like a T-shirt, with a kind of a slogan on it, like for a whole year or something. I'm not decided. I'm not going to do it for a year, but I've decided I've got my Greenpeace T-shirt. I'm going to wear it until COP26. So I've been wearing it for 25 days now. The novelty has definitely worn off, but I'm going to keep going till 31st of October when COP26 begins. I've also become increasingly, convicted would be the spiritual way of saying it, increasingly conscious of the injustice that's been done by the church to LGBT siblings, and very, very challenged in recent years about my own complicity in the silence that they're offering is in local Baptist churches. We don't, that's not true of all Baptist churches, but often we don't talk about the issue of sexuality because it's so emotive, because they have such strong opinions. And I've I've become increasingly uncomfortable with that silence and my complicity in that silence. And it was a great moment of pride for me when the Methodist Church voted this summer to allow same-sex marriages, weddings to take place in Methodist churches. And that's something that makes me very proud to work for the Methodist Church.
And it's, I was about to say national. I don't know if it's international or not, but it's National Coming Out Day today, in fact, as we record.
Is it really?
I think the 11th of October. That may be a global thing, and I've reduced it to being UK specific, but it is a day today. My Twitter feed has featured a number of interesting stories this morning. So, Emma, one of the things we do is we always ask the JPIT team to give us a little heads up on some of the political stories of the week. So I've got a few things here that might set a bit of a context in addition to what we've already mentioned. This week is Challenge Poverty Week in England and Wales. It was Scotland last week. I don't know why they don't all happen at the same time, but they don't. But in this week, England and Wales. A week to challenge the prevalence and existence of poverty across the nation. Obviously, we've mentioned the continued build-up to COP26. We had the joint faith leaders and scientists statement from the Vatican last week. The march or the pilgrimage heading up to Scotland from the Young Network is going really well as well. And obviously, we have the ongoing conversations about the cost of living. Which ties in, I guess, to Challenge Poverty Week in many ways, and lots of stories about food and gas prices over the weekend. I'm sure I won't be the only one who's had emails from their energy supplier saying that everything's going up in recent days. And how does that then connect with, obviously, their universal credit uplift being removed? The ongoing sort of simmering conversation about misogyny being a hate crime, which sort of came out of some comments at the Conservative Party conference last week. And then overseas, we've got the floods in China with nearly 2 million people displaced and the ongoing impact of climate change. And then reading in recent days about the power outages in Lebanon. And it's quite a strong Baptist community in Lebanon, and had connections there for some time, and they've been without power, although I think it's back on this morning, but quite scary to find a whole nation without the means to turn the lights on. And Lebanon is a country smaller than London, which has millions of refugees from surrounding nations and carries a great burden on behalf of the international community as well. So those are some of the things that are going on around our conversation this morning and may provide some helpful links with what we're going to be coming on to in our lectionary texts. We'll think about that a bit now, really. We've got 3 texts, as we always do, and they're all from the same book or books that we were in last week, indeed the last 2 weeks. So we're in Job, we're in Hebrews, and we're in Mark chapter 10. Emma, where do you want to start? Are there themes? Are there issues? Is there a particular text? Where would you be beginning?
Well, I have to say, I did rub my hands with glee when I saw the Job reading. Okay. I really did. My first thought was the Da Vinci Code. Just a little bit of a niche kind of reference there for anyone who's seen the film or read. No, I think it's only in the book anyway. But I was really, really struck by that moment when God speaks out of the whirlwind. And my paraphrase of it, feel free to challenge this, David, but is, Job has suffered horrible tragedy, terrible heartache. His friends have been not very successfully trying to cheer him up or buck him up for chapters and chapters. And then God finally speaks, and God says, "Where were you when I made the world?" And it's not comfortable. You could be forgiven for thinking, God, could you not? I'm not sure how much that helps someone in terrible suffering. So I was really, really struck by that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting reading. And I mean, Job's, as we've discussed the last couple of weeks on the podcast, is an interesting one to reflect on and preach, particularly if one wants to avoid cliche. And yes, I think this was the tone of this. I did so much is the tone with which you read it in your head. I think for me, I read this as the classic big booming voice in the sky. Sort of, you can hear that tone to it. And I've been trying to read it this morning to hear if I can read it differently and sort of hear it spoken differently, but I've not managed that very successfully, I have to say. It's kind of like God's great riposte to all of the previous chapters of people not being very happy. And there was just a sense of the greatness of God here, isn't there? There's a sense of awe and God being above that I think comes across quite clearly. The other thing I thought that comes across here a little bit in Job is about God's sort of the sense of the meticulous care for creation. There's a sense in which the dimensions have been measured and God's put things in their place. And I thought, obviously, coming out of the season of creation, heading towards COP, there's definitely something in there too. What do you make of the juxtaposition of the sense of perhaps God saying, "I'm in control of this," and Job saying, "Well, that's part of the problem here because I'm not very happy with it." How does that all sit together for you? And if you were preaching it, how would you attempt to square the circle, or would you just be saying, "I'm not sure how we square this thing. How do we make it work?"
Well, one of the brief notes I made when I was preparing for today was lean into the discomfort, and that's something I came across at theological college through others preaching, particularly remember Beth Allison Glennie preaching on a very, very difficult Old Testament text and really not shying away from any of the painful bits. And that would tend to be my approach now. God seems to be taunting Job here. It's almost like, tell me if you know. Yeah, you don't know, do you? And that's deeply uncomfortable. And yet there's another sense in which God's response does feel helpful and fitting in a sense. This idea of, well, I made the world and you didn't. So what makes you think that you understand everything? And I was really reminded of a book called, I think it's Face to Face, by Frances Young, who's a Methodist academic and presbyter. She's retired now, as far as I'm aware. And she wrote about her eldest son who has profound and complex disabilities. And she really, really struggled to come to terms with his needs and him not having the life that she had hoped for him. And she wrestles with that. And she tells this incredible story of sitting in a chair, kind of trying to talk to God, or possibly even not consciously talking to God, and then sensing God saying, "It doesn't make any difference to me whether you believe or not." And I had the great pleasure to meet Frances Young. She came to speak at Regent's while I was there, and I asked her, actually, what did you think God meant by that? Because it sounds quite harsh. It doesn't make any difference to me whether you believe or not. Wow. And what she said, or what I understood from what she said, was it was this sense of God is bigger than all this. God doesn't need me to justify God. It was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, so I'm just making a note there of Francis's name, because that does sound really interesting. And does the Job reading naturally link with the other two in any particular way? Were you able to draw any lines between them? Not that one has to, but...
Well, what kind of jumped out at me in terms of themes was between Job and Matthew was this sense of, we're not as clever as we think we are, and we're not as in control as we think we are, So it's interesting that Jesus, when the disciples ask Jesus, "Can we sit at your left and your right?" He says, "You don't know what you're asking." And I seem to remember someone talking about, the criminals crucified at Jesus' right and Jesus' left, and that they had no concept of what it would mean to be at his right and his left. So that kind of jumped out at me, this sense of that we don't know, and then of course Jesus is saying, those who want to be greatest among you need to be the slave of all. So God is not just saying you're not as powerful as you think you are, but Jesus is kind of telling his disciples to embrace powerlessness. That kind of struck me as an interesting connection.
I like that. Well, let's perhaps follow that thread and head into our gospel reading. So we're continuing on with Mark chapter 10. I think it's a really interesting little moment in the gospel, given everything that's gone before. So there's this sense of sort of here's this new regime, this new social order, this new kingdom that's being established. And we've come to the end of this section of teaching on sort of the renunciation of social power, really. And I don't know about you, but I read it, you can almost feel Jesus' weariness, that having said all that he's said and done all that he's done, this is what they're coming to him with. So, all right, Jesus, we get that the old order is gone, but in the new one, can I have the best? It just, I don't know, the disappointment of it is almost palpable, I think, as you read it. Just the whole tone again of the passage feels exasperated rather than bombastic or anything else. And there's just a sense in which I hadn't connected that with Job there, but just this sense of they really don't get it, James and John, here in verse 39. It says, we can, we do. And they really, almost by demonstrating that, they haven't really demonstrated that they understand quite what they've asked. But
I found myself wondering if I was, wondering how valid it was, but I found myself thinking about some of the feminist theologies of sin that I read, because it sounds very morbid, but I have a particular interest in theology of sin. It's the subject of my dissertation, and some feminist theologians have argued that sin is often characterized primarily as about pride, is about wanting to have power and influence, and that to repent means to be humble. And they've argued that pride is not a woman's besetting sin. Now, obviously, that is a very, very sweeping statement. But I found myself wondering that, because you could take this passage and say, as humans, we always want to lord it over people, don't we? Mm-hmm. And I wondered, is that true of everybody? But then I found myself thinking, well, women can be just as manipulative and just as power-seeking as men, but perhaps sometimes do it in different ways. And I found myself thinking about mission, when, whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servants, and thinking about our tendency to try to hold on to power in mission and in evangelism, and the importance of giving away power. I was thinking about when I first went to theological college and I was in my 30s, and you mentioned that I'm an accredited evangelist. And I had all these, I now see, very naive views about living in college and evangelizing people, because I went to Regents, which is a community, a really interesting, really mixed community with people studying all kinds of different subjects, some people of faith, some not. And I thought I would be evangelizing people. And actually, when I got there, I was really lonely. They were all a lot younger than me. It was no one's fault. It just that was my experience. And I found myself making some friends, and particularly often found myself chatting to the international students. They tended to be a bit older and they often kind of didn't know too many people, and realizing actually I am having all sorts of interesting conversations with people who wouldn't describe themselves as people of faith. But that's not because I've gone out and been a great evangelist. It's because I'm lonely and I need friends. I just found that it's been a really interesting one to reflect on since, about the place of power in mission.
Really interesting. I hadn't particularly thought about it in terms of gender in the way that you bring in the feminist angle to that, which is really interesting. But I had thought of that whole dynamic and how this is a particular temptation for some. I was thinking about it more in terms of class, for want of better language, actually. Some people just walk into a room and assume that they're in charge, and they assume that very naturally, and other people walk into a room and just assume that they're not, and just that, whether that's in education or in a variety of settings. And people go to certain universities or certain schools, et cetera, but I think regardless of almost what the particular spectrum is, that there is a truth here about this is a particular temptation for some more than others. I think this lording over. Really interesting to reflect on that in terms of mission as well. Really interesting. One of the things I don't know what you made of this as well is how what they ask sort of ruffles the feathers of the other disciples here too. I don't know what you made of it. I wondered whether that indicated sort of their response almost could be read as, well, we're just sorry we didn't get there first. Actually, what they're cross about is that, James and John had asked the question rather than them. They don't seem, I don't read it as they're cross that the question has been asked. They're not frustrated with them for having got it wrong. They're frustrated with them for getting one over on them. But I don't know. What did you make of that encounter?
I didn't particularly notice that, but now you pose the question, certainly to me, it reads as, hey, why should you have the best seats? We want them, and because then Jesus, goes into this teaching section, doesn't he, by saying, the Gentiles lord it over people. It's not so among you. He's thinking, oh, great, I've got to explain this again. I think I read it the same way you do.
And in which case it's kind of an indictment on the whole community and their sort of struggle for power and their desire to be the ones who lord it over. I read somewhere in preparation for this morning, it's probably in Ched Meyer's Binding the Strong Man, which is obviously the go-to thing for Mark in many ways. It says, leadership belongs only to those who learn and follow the way of non-violence, who are prepared not to dominate, but prepared to serve and suffer at Jesus' side. And that there is a sense you get in here, and I wonder if there's something with Job as well, probably with Hebrews too, just about the burden of responsibility that comes from leadership. You may well have this experience too. I know plenty of people who want to be in charge, and then when they get there, they don't really know what they want to do with that. They don't particularly like the burden of being in charge, but the quest has been to be the one in charge. There's certainly plenty of political analogies one could make about that. The quest for power is almost a thing in and of itself, rather than that being an element of service in order to get a different job done. So that makes sense. Sort of the hinterland is small.
Yeah, well, I do, in collaboration with others, a fair bit of work around leadership, transformational leadership, as part of my role for the Methodist Church, and we grapple with this tension of how, just to make a very kind of sweeping statement, that there's often a spectrum in views of leadership. On the one hand, particularly Christian leaders will say, we're servant leaders, we're pastors, shepherds of the flock. It's not for us to seize power. And on the other hand, you can have more of you've got a dominating view of leadership's about making people do things they don't want to do. And so in our work we do spend time kind of exploring that tension. What does it mean to lead, to be a servant leader, and yet to get things done? I don't think it's about jumping to one spectrum or the other. And I also often say to people who are hesitant about the whole idea of grasping any kind of power as a Christian, I would tend to say, well, you do have power. We all have power, and in different ways, and we just need to be aware of the power we have. So, for example, how in our Baptist context, if someone stands up in a church meeting and says something, there are certain people in the church where if they say something, everyone listens.
Yeah.
Now, they may be saying it out of, the purest of motives. They may be a very deeply prayerful person, and there may be nothing manipulative in that at all. And yet the fact is they do carry power.
Very much so. Yes, there's sort of those unofficial elders of the church in a way that have that position. Yeah, very much so. And I was reading as well about a link that a couple of people were making between this passage and 1 Samuel 8, where there's this desire to have a king like all the other nations, just to be like everybody else, rather than to live and exercise responsibility in a way that is distinct. And I thought, if I was choosing an Old Testament reading to go with this passage, I think I might have been inclined to go to 1 Samuel 8. I can see that sort of repudiation of politics as normal, that desire for things to be different. What else strikes you in this Mark passage?
Just having a look at the notes that I made.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So a little bit controversial.
We love controversial. Go for it.
Okay. She hesitates. I found myself wondering if there's a risk of spiritualizing marginalization and lack of power. So, just to be blunt, if being the slave of all, if being, well, it's an unfortunate word to use, isn't it? It's an unfortunate translation. Slavery was an appalling thing, and is still sadly an appalling reality in our world today. But just to move away from actual slavery, but just to think about marginalization and lack of power, if it's good to be lowly, then why do we want to help people out of poverty and give people more power if powerlessness is a good thing? And I was, and I thought, am I over spiritualizing? And then I was thinking about the fact that ministers and other Christian workers, those who work for churches or Christian organizations, can sometimes be struggling on very little money, on very poor conditions. A lot of people work for free or for housing only, and it can be seen as unseemly to be demanding adequate pay or adequate housing, because you're doing this for God. Why are you talking about money? It can be very, very tricky. Yeah, there you go. There's my controversy for the morning.
I like that. That's a thought that's going to fester. Is there a risk of spiritualizing marginalization, and that particularly links, if we think of it being challenge, poverty, weak, and the cost of living stuff. I think that really resonates with question, why are we trying to take people out of poverty if that's the place where we're all supposed to be, for example? Yeah, like that a lot. I thought there was quite a natural connection between the gospel reading and Hebrews. I'd almost be tempted just to read the Hebrews reading out and say, well, go figure, on the Sunday. But what did you make of Hebrews? Hebrews 5 we're in this week.
I didn't, David. I didn't really make anything of it. Sorry.
Oh,
so I had this
right.
out.
I don't think I have anything controversial to throw in, but I think obviously it kind of is in two halves. You've got the first bit where it's talking about the role of the high priest from the people. It was really interesting how this is emphasized here, to represent the people. It's very much from within, which I think in all the JPIT denominations would be something we would recognize theologically in a number of ways. And the thing that I thought was interesting in that is this bit that we read here. I think it's verse 2, maybe. Since the high priest is from the people, is also subject to weakness, that makes them deal gently with other people. So I thought that was a really interesting, that within the role of the high priest is this expectation of gentleness whilst exercising that authority, because there but for the grace of God go I'm subject to weakness as well. I thought that was a really interesting thing. So the gentleness is picked out as a particular virtue that the high priest needs to have. But also in verse 4 it says that no one takes this honor upon themselves, for they receive it when they're called by God. So again, we don't go seeking power. Now if it calls and it comes and you have the opportunity to exercise that, then gentleness needs to be part of it. But again, there was none of this, give me the best seat, Jesus. You don't go looking to be the high priest. A bit like, I don't know if anyone ever said to you when you're exploring ministry, only do it if you can't possibly conceive of doing anything else. And I think I get that now in a way I didn't when I started.
Yeah, that was certainly said to me, or variations of that.
That sort of thing.
My pastor at the time did his best to put me off in a good way. Like he kind of really wanted to know that I would have a realistic idea of what it might be to be a minister before going for it. And there's something interesting there, isn't there, about when any Christian leader and being, I guess some have felt that they need to be seen to be a good example and be seen, that showing vulnerability in the pulpit or vulnerability as a minister. Some, I guess, are more comfortable with it than others. I always find myself having to walk this line between not wanting to treat the pulpit as therapy,
yes.
I work through my issues with God before everyone, and yet recognizing that my vulnerability is something I share with the congregation, is something through which God can speak, not just despite which. And so over the years, I've made very deliberate decisions to talk about mental health issues from the pulpit, for example, because I've suffered with anxiety since I was a teenager. And that kind of sharing that kind of thing can be incredibly powerful, because it can give people permission to say, yeah, that's a problem for me too. And I've found that. But it's also something that we have to be wise about, isn't it? And I love what Nadia Bolz-Weber says about, preaching from your scars, not your wounds. If it's a gaping wound, if it's something that's still deeply painful to you, maybe don't talk about it in a sermon. And yet showing vulnerability can be so helpful and healing for other people. I've also found myself, as I'm never quite sure what I think my ordination meant. Possibly.
Okay.
As a Baptist minister, I believe that ministry is for all people. I believe I was ordained when I was baptized. And, so for many years, Baptists didn't ordain their ministers, as you know. It's a relatively recent thing that we've been ordaining people. And I've never quite managed to resolve in my mind, how am I different from others in the church? And I found myself wondering whether it's about living a Christian life in public, that I'm almost representing. And I think this is what Nigel Wright meant. I read a great article by Nigel Wright about this. And if it may not be what he meant, but what I thought he meant was that that part of being a minister is representing the church to itself, living a Christian life in front of people, and enabling people to work out their own Christian life by watching you live yours.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And then the second part of the Hebrews reading basically then talks about how Jesus is the exemplar of how to make this work. Himself, the glory of becoming the high priest, and then it talks about the order of Melchizedek, and then it talks about how Jesus, like as the high priest, offered prayers and petitions for the people, and that he suffered and became the source of eternal salvation for the people. This idea that Jesus is one who prays for us, I think, is still, however many years I've been attempting to follow him, still is something that I find moving and humbling. But yet there's a sense in which the way in which Jesus exercises power is thoroughly healthy and within how it's supposed to be. I think Hebrews is very good at emphasizing how Jesus is as it's supposed to be generally. But you've almost got quite a direct link here with that in Hebrews, which is where I think I would draw the connection with the gospel reading this week. Some weeks I get a sense in which there's one I probably wouldn't do much with, but this week I think I'd be referencing all three as part of what I'm doing, and to talk about the way in which we exercise power and responsibility in these days is as relevant as it's ever been, and has so much to say to some of the issues that we face at the moment. Preparing for this week or looking at these readings, would you be inclined to do anything different? Would you be preaching it in a particular way? Is there any sort of art or inspiration that sort of comes to mind so far? I haven't got anything to offer in this way this week, but we like to try and ask the question where we can.
It's something I said towards the beginning, so apologies for the repetition, but I think, again, in preaching, it would be wanting to stay with the discomfort of these passages, particularly Job and Mark were the ones I spent most time reflecting on, and the ones I found most uncomfortable, and not trying to make it all okay too quickly, enabling people to sit with that discomfort and see how it makes them feel, and what God might say through that discomfort. If focusing on Job, I think I'd probably be inclined to ask a lot of questions, and wonder about some answers rather than offering answers. Does God mean this? Could God mean that? Was God angry with Job? Was God taunting Job? And kind of offering a few suggestions rather than trying to nail it down, because I think there's a lot of mystery there.
Yeah, very much so. It's reminded me very much of godly play, and how this might be a sermon where I'd be asking a lot of wondering questions rather than seeking to offer any answers. And I think Mark's Gospel lends itself to that quite well, actually, of all the Gospels even. There's a fantastic book called Being Interrupted by Al Barrett and Ruth Harley, which I think has come out in the last year or so. And they have 4 chapters on bits of Mark's Gospel, and at the end have sort of wondering questions about them. I think I would be inclined to take that sort of a lead in this as well, and just give space for people to think. So yeah, perhaps a bit of a godly play inspired wondering this week. Great. Well, Emma, thank you for coming on the podcast, for sharing with us this week. Really appreciate your wisdom and insight. Folks, this is the halfway point of this season. This is week 6. We've got 5 more to go this term. But thank you for being part of it. You can join the conversation on Twitter. We've got our own Politics in the Pulpit Twitter page, or on Facebook via the JPIT Facebook page as well. Let us know what you're making of these readings. Let us know if there's obvious connections that you've made that we haven't seen, or if anything that's been said today particularly strikes you. We'd love to hear how you're getting on with these passages this week. But as you head into our proverbial pulpits, or perhaps even a literal pulpit where you are, we finish with a blessing. So may the blessing of the God of peace and justice be with us. May the blessing of the Son who weeps the tears of the world's suffering be with us. And may the blessing of the Spirit who inspires us to reconciliation and hope be with us from now and into eternity. Amen.